I've been collecting many interesting and downright spooky stories that my listeners have sent to me. Some of them were featured on my Strange Encounters episodes, while many others were locked away, waiting for the right opportunity to come knocking. Well, that time has come. So lock your doors, draw the shades, light the candles, and put on a pot of coffee, because tonight it's storytelling time. Story 1 by Nicole. Several years ago, I was involved in a solo project with the Bureau of Land Management in Northern California. I was working in an area called the Headwaters Forest Preserve, which consists of about 7,500 acres of protected old-growth redwood trees. The Elk River Trail, which begins as an old logging road and eventually narrows to a dirt path, follows alongside the Elk River for several miles, where the trail eventually ends, and the river keeps going. My job was to follow the river beyond this point for a few miles to monitor river flow and any potential buildup from the previous winter's buildup of debris. So one morning, I set out with my notebook and a roll of flagging. Around 9 a.m., I passed the point where the trail ends and continued up along the riverbank. It wasn't long until I saw my first spot, a clump of broken trees cutting through a 15-foot section of river. I scribbled some notes and tied some orange flagging to a nearby tree. 15 minutes later, I came up to another section of river, a massive buildup of fallen timber, a clear obstruction perpetually forcing the river to cut further into the bank. More notes, and another orange marker. I continued on. About 30 minutes later, I noticed something strange. I came across some fresh boot prints in the mud, followed by some ridiculously familiar geological features. Yet I had never been beyond this point before. What came next stopped me dead in my tracks. I saw an orange marker on a branch, and when I looked over to the nearby river, I saw a cluster of broken trees cutting across a 15-foot section of river. I'll be damned if I hadn't already been here, but I had been just 30 minutes prior. Alright, as strange as it may have been, I told myself it was just an old site, familiar in layout, that another worker had previously marked. I went on, but it didn't take me long to figure out something wasn't right. To my complete and utter surprise, I came across the second site that I had previously marked. Every single thing about it was eerily familiar, stemming from the exact location of the marker down to the mess of debris in the river nearby. And when I gazed down at the footprints ahead of me, son of a gun, they were exactly the same size and shape as mine. It was about that time I began to feel scared, because I knew without a doubt that I had never backtracked and the river doesn't go in circles. At that point, I realized that I was caught inside some kind of time loop or whatever. And what really shook me was thinking whether or not I'd ever get out. I got the hell out of there and made a mad dash back from which I came. The further on I went, everything appeared normal, but to be certain, I stopped and marked various sites along the way, just in case the strangeness continued on with me. Eventually, I reached the first site, and thank God, there was only one pair of boot prints where I had been. Soon thereafter, I reached the trail, and a big sigh of relief came over me. I made it back to the truck, and that was that. A few days later, I told a friend of mine what happened, and we decided to go back and follow that same trail again, just to see if anything strange would occur. But everything was normal. I mentioned my experience to a couple other coworkers, but as expected, they sort of just brushed it off. I don't know what this experience was, but I do know it happened. I'd be curious to know if anyone else out there had the same thing happen to them. Story 2, submitted by Justin Beaverton. In the summer of 1993, I went to a summer camp designated for foster youth, as I was a ward of the court for most of my young life. The summer camp was located in a remote area outside of San Rafael, California, and the program was for a 2-week period. You wouldn't think it, but this part of San Rafael was heavily wooded and far away from the comforts or annoyances of city life. I didn't know it at the time, but the camp was located within an arm's reach of the Muir Woods National Monument, a large forested area consisting of nearly 600 acres in size. I was only 11 years old when I arrived at the camp, and there were approximately 15 of us kids there. There were 5 cabins located on the premises, housing approximately 3 to 4 campers in each one. I was bunked with 2 others, and my cabin was the furthest away from the camp center and practically in the woods. I was about halfway through my stay when I had this experience. I awoke in the middle of the night and had to relieve myself. I jumped off the top bunk of the bunk bed and onto the cold wooden flooring of the cabin and creaked my way up to the door. My bunkmates were sound asleep, snoring up a storm in the meantime. I opened the door and was met with the cold night's welcome and made my way to the side corner of the cabin. I began to do my business, and as I did so, I looked up to a nearby hill and was surprised to see a large animal looking down at me, and about 30 feet away or so. From what I could observe, I can only make out an outline of this thing. I say thing because even to this day, I still can't quite describe what I saw. But from memory, simply put, it was a werewolf-looking creature. It stood like a man, about 7 to 8 feet tall, very well built, and had a pair of large pointy ears that stood up like a pair of devil's horns. But it was the snout that I remember most about it. It was like a size 20 boot protruding from its head, and judging from the angle of it, it looked as though its attention was directed off to the side of it. But the feeling I got was that it had remained frozen ever since it heard me exit the cabin. It must have been staring directly at me with those eyes that were hidden in the veil of darkness. I also got the impression that it thought I had no idea of its presence. Even in my shock and confusion, my primal instincts kicked in, and I knew not to turn my back to it, but instead to back away slowly and make my way back inside the cabin. One wrong move could have triggered a bad reaction from it. So that's what I did. I slowly backed away and got back into the cabin, and that whole time, it never moved, just stayed there, frozen like a statue. I don't remember much after that, but I can tell you this experience left me a changed man. I don't know what it was, but I do know what it wasn't. Thanks for letting me share my story. Story 3 by Kelly Garcia. On July 30th of 2013, my husband and I were on a 3-day hiking trip through the Maine wilderness. We set out on a 20-mile trek along the Appalachian Trail, where we would eventually be picked up by a friend at a designated meeting point. It was a very pleasant hike, and everything seemed normal until the last day of our trip. On that third and final day of the hike, we set out at approximately 7 a.m. and didn't break until around noon. We dropped our backpacks, grabbed a splash, and just took in the surrounding beauty, priding ourselves on all the progress we made so far. At that point, we began to hear a distant wailing. At first, I thought it was a bird, but the longer we listened, the more human it sounded, and it sounded like a cry for help. Now, where we were, there was absolutely no cell phone service, so we began yelling back. The cries came from deep inside the wilderness, just slightly east from us, as we were heading west. From what we could make out, it was a woman's voice we were hearing. It was barely intelligible, but seemed to be responding to us. We asked if she was lost or hurt, but the response was so faint and muffled by the trees. This went on for nearly 30 minutes or so before the cries eventually faded away. At this point, we knew there wasn't much we could do but try to make it to a spot where we could get cell phone service and call for help. We didn't want to take any chances of getting lost ourselves, so we decided not to go off the trail to look for the woman. We felt helpless, but knew we had no other choice. Unfortunately, it would be another 3 or 4 hours before we could call for help. And when we were able to reach the authorities, we tried our best to describe the location where we heard the woman's desperate cries for help. They thanked us, and we continued hiking. Eventually, we reached the meeting spot that evening, and our friend picked us up. It wasn't long until we saw something in the news that caught our attention. The story was about a 66-year-old woman who vanished on the Appalachian Trail around the same time we were on our hiking trip. Apparently, the woman disappeared on July 22nd after leaving the trail to relieve herself. Her name was Geraldine Largey, and her disappearance made national headlines. If this was the same woman we heard crying for help, and we were pretty sure it was, then she would have been missing nearly a week by the time we came through that part of the trail. The thought of this really bothered us for a long time. We were so close to that poor woman, yet so helpless. She must have been suffering and desperate for help by the time we came through. We were right there. Searchers did everything they could to locate her. We gave them every detail we had, but nothing turned up. It wasn't until October 2015, over 2 years later, that a forestry worker discovered her body in a very remote area off the trail. Apparently, the woman had set up camp and lived out her final days there, struggling to survive with hardly any food or water. In her tent, authorities found a journal she had been keeping about her unfortunate circumstances. Her final journal entry stated, quote, "When you find my body, please call my husband George and daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now. Please find it in your heart to mail the contents of this bag to one of them," end quote. Geraldine had committed to a long hike through the Appalachian Trail and had already traversed nearly 1,000 miles by the time she disappeared. Her husband met her along the trail for small reunions and resupplies. I hope this story is a reminder to all hikers to take extra precautions while out in the wilderness. It's too easy to disappear out there, and you should never go hiking by yourself. This experience will forever haunt me. Story number 4 by Shane Wilbur. I'm a maintenance worker for the U.S. Forest Service. On May 3rd of this year, I was scheduled to do some repair work on a fire lookout tower at the summit of Devil's Head in Douglas County, Colorado. The tower is located on a large pinnacle of Pikes Peak within the Pike National Forest, and the only way to access it is by hiking up the Devil's Head Recreational Trail. The trail is only a 2.8-mile hike, or 4.5 kilometers round trip, and goes up to an elevation of 9,748 feet. The trail opened later than usual due to a harder than usual winter, so not many people had been on it before I was sent up. I grabbed my tools and a few necessities before setting out on the short hike sometime around noon that day. I reached the lookout tower a short time later and assessed the needed repairs. It would only take me 2 to 3 hours to complete. Everything went smoothly, and I left to head back down the trail. About midway through, I came across a red backpack sitting slightly off to the side of the trail, with some old hiking gear and expired food inside. I thought it was rather odd that I somehow missed it on my way up. I slung it over my shoulders and continued on. Then I saw a single hiking boot, but this time it was directly on the trail, like it had been deliberately placed there. There's no way I missed it going up, so somebody must have come up the trail behind me at some point and dropped it. Well, I returned to the parking lot a short time later, and other than my service rig, there were no other vehicles in the lot. An eerie feeling then came over me as I was suddenly reminded of a 48-year-old hiker who went missing the previous year and was never found. Park records showed that there were no visitors during my visit, which only made things more unsettling. When I inquired about the missing man, it was noted that he was last seen with a red backpack, just like the one that I recovered on the trail. He was also wearing a pair of hiking boots. The man's disappearance is still currently being investigated, and therefore his name being withheld. This experience was one of the strangest things that I've ever come across during my work in the Forest Service, and to this day, I refuse to go anywhere in the Devil's Head area by myself. Story 5 by Paul Sanders. I live in a remote part of Alaska in a 2-story cabin with my 5-year-old son. We live on a plot of land the size of a small country, with the nearest neighbor being several miles east of us. Most of the time, we live off the land, with the occasional supply run into town, the closest being 45 minutes away. Every winter, we can expect blizzard-like conditions, so when the winter of '95 came, this was no exception. We have 3 dogs to keep us company and to ward off any unwanted guests, such as wild animals or, quote, lost hunters who sometimes like to stick their nose in other people's business. With 3 well-trained dogs, we felt pretty secure living out there. until one night they all just vanished. It was February of 1995 and a strong winter storm moved into the area. Our dogs, a black lab, border collie, and a Rottweiler, had a nice spot to hang out on the deck, overlooking the property. Nothing got past them, not without them sounding the alarm anyway. They would bark at everything. Everything from a baby squirrel to a mountain lion who wandered onto the property. Let's just say, wild animals never stayed around long, as you might imagine. But one night, I awoke to the sound of our dogs howling. It jolted me right out of a sound sleep, because I had never heard them quite like this before. I went over to the front windows and saw the dogs cowering by the front door. They were terrified of something, but what? Nothing scared them. Maybe it was the foul weather, I told myself, but that didn't even make sense considering they've been through plenty of storms, and storms stronger than this one. I grabbed my pistol and spotlight and walked out onto the deck, scanning the surrounding property. I stood out there for about a half an hour, just watching and waiting for any movement, but nothing. My dogs were all inside the house now, hiding behind furniture. My 5-year-old son was upstairs asleep. I remember being a bit angry at my dogs for acting like cowards and not standing up to whatever was out there. I depended on them for security, for safety, but they weren't acting like themselves. They stayed inside with me for the rest of the night, but eventually returned to their spot outside on the deck the following day. However, a few nights later, I was once again awoken by their howling, and when I went over to the window, they were nowhere to be seen. I stepped out onto the deck, spotlight in one hand and gun in the other. I scanned the property and called for them. Nothing. Not a single sound other than the howling wind from the approaching snowstorm. I remember getting a strange feeling like I was being observed, so I quickly went back inside, turned the lights off, and stayed up the rest of the night watching, waiting for my dogs to return. But they never did. A large snowstorm bombarded the area for the next few weeks and covered up any trace of what may have happened to them. Even after the snow melted, I never did find any sign or clue as to their whereabouts. To this day, I am completely baffled by this strange tragedy. Well, I hope you enjoyed these strange stories. If you have any you'd like to contribute for future videos, feel free to do so. You can email them to top10strangeworld@gmail.com. Have yourselves a fine Halloween, and you'll hear from me soon enough. Thanks for listening, and subscribe for more videos. Good night.